Hi, I'm Hal Roberts. This is Bridge City News. Here's some of the top stories we've been following. Crews in Ukraine cleared the rubble from a Ukrainian theater that was hit by shelling, killing around 300 people. Bikers who are riding into our nation's capital for Rolling Thunder this weekend have been issued a warning by the city of Ottawa. We chat with John Carpy from the Justice Centre about the bikers' right to protest. And we hear from Lethbridge MP Rachel Thomas, who says Canadians should be concerned that the Liberals are looking into criminalizing free speech.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Roberts.
Thanks so much for joining us. The cost of the war between Ukraine and Russia continues to climb. There are estimates now that 11 million Ukrainians have been driven from their homes. In Lyman, a town in Donetsk where Russian forces are reportedly trying to advance, shells continue to rain down, devastating so many families.
Такой взрыв, дым. Ты ничего не слышишь, перед глазами у тебя ничего нет, ты только видишь, на земле лежит твой внук, дочка кричит, ну кричит. Ты больше ничего не видишь, не слышишь. Хватаешь этого внука, дочку, тянешь в погреб, потому что ты даже не понимаешь, может еще стреляют, может не стреляют, потому что я до сих пор даже не слышу, ну плохо слышу. Это очень страшный ужас. С этого. Когда не думали, что война будет у нас. Тебе.
Ну, обстрел их привезли, отец.
Crews continue to clear debris from the ruins of Mariupol's drama theater after it was destroyed by shelling last month. Frequent bombings have almost completely destroyed the city's local history museum. Ukrainian authorities say around 300 people were killed as they sheltered within the theater when it was struck on March the 16th. Employees of the museum attempted to recover exhibits damaged following a fire caused by Russian bombing. Relatives of a former U.S. Marine say he'd been killed fighting alongside Ukrainian forces. It's believed to be the first death of a U.S. citizen fighting in Ukraine. Rebecca Cabrera says her son, a 22-year-old Willie Joseph Cancel, was killed Monday while working for a military contracting company that sent him to Ukraine. His widow, Brittany Cancel, says her husband was a hero who leaves behind a young son. Health Canada says it is reviewing the first request to approve a COVID-19 vaccine for very young children. The Moderna application is for kids between the ages of 6 months to 5 years of age. The company says a trial of 6,700 children determined the vaccine is safe and produced a similar antibody response to those seen in adults. Health Canada received Moderna's application earlier today after the company made a similar request to the U.S. Food and Drug Administration on Thursday. Hundreds of bikers are set to roll into Ottawa this weekend. Organizers of the Rolling Thunder Convoy say they're bringing a message similar to that of the truckers in February with the Freedom Convoy to have the federal government remove all remaining restrictions, including allowing non-vaccinated Canadians to be able to fly again. The Ottawa Police Chief says they'll be watching the situation closely and do not want the bikers to converge on Parliament Hill. Ottawa Mayor Jim Watson has also spoken out against this. Now, joining us to talk about this is the president of the Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms, John Carpy. And John joins us now from Calgary. John, do the folks with Rolling Thunder have a legal right to be there and to protest?
Absolutely. The charter includes the freedoms of expression, association, and peaceful assembly. And as long as you're not breaking any law, then you've got that freedom to protest peacefully. And in fact, it's one of the cornerstones of our democracy is for people to be able to gather together in the streets, whether it's to celebrate victory for your favorite hockey team, or whether it's a funeral march to mourn the loss of somebody, whether it's religious, social, political. We have a right in a free country to be out and about in the streets. And so it's very disconcerting that the Ottawa mayor and council have created this so-called motor vehicle exclusion zone without even passing a bylaw. So we've written to the mayor about that.
So what specifically is in the letter you and your team wrote to the Ottawa mayor?
So we told Ottawa Mayor Jim Watson that we fully support the enforcement of municipal bylaws. So if anybody is littering, if it's a noise bylaw violation because they're making too much noise, if they're blockading or obstructing streets, anything that's unlawful, the Ottawa Police can and should crack down on and enforce the law.
So, John, what do you say to the people of Ottawa who simply want peace and harmony and are sick of these protests?
People in Ottawa are accustomed to the fact that there are protests of all sorts on all political issues. Ottawa has seen protests about immigration and abortion and climate change and taxes and Russia-Ukraine conflict, every kind of protest imaginable. And it's especially important for Canadians to be able to go to Ottawa, because then whether you're from BC or Newfoundland or anywhere in between, you can go to our nation's capital and make your voice heard in a peaceful manner.
Thanks so much, John. That was John Carpe, president of the Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms, joining us from Calgary. Members of the Manitoba legislature have invited Pope Francis to come to Manitoba when he tours Canada later this summer. The motion put forward by the opposition NDP was passed unanimously. It asks for the Pope to visit the graves of children who died in residential schools and to bestow a blessing on the grave of Métis leader Louis Riel. Government House Leader Kelvin Goertzen says an understanding of residential schools cannot be achieved by simply reading or hearing about them. 4 days after a snowstorm hit southeastern Saskatchewan, all of those who lost power in the region now have it back. Sask Power says crews were able to restore power Thursday afternoon to the last of its customers who were without electricity. The Crown Corporation says the lights went out for nearly 25,000 customers when the storm hit. Sask Power says people in the region may experience a few short outages in the next few days as crews continue to make repairs to the system. Well, all of the snow in our region has been gone for quite some time here, but we could use a little bit more moisture here in southwestern Alberta. Jeanette Rocher is in now with an early look at the forecast. Jeanette, not much rain in our forecast. As we make our way for next week, it'll feel even more like summer.
Yeah, it sure will. How by midweek next week, we're looking at 25 and 29 degrees, which is well above that seasonal high of 15, 16 degrees for this time of year. Not much rain in the forecast either, like you had mentioned. Now, this evening, we're looking at an overnight low of -2. Hard to believe we're going to be in the mid-20s by next week. Into Saturday, beautiful sunny day with a high of 14 degrees. As for the rest of the weekend and next week, I will tell you all about that coming up later on in the newscast.
Thanks so much, Jeanette. You know, many Alberta families are hurting due to the high cost of fuel for their vehicles, higher natural gas prices for their homes, and of course the cost of groceries going through the roof. Now, many are not happy about it, and a number of Lethbridge residents have brought their concerns to Lethbridge MP Rachel Thomas. Thomas says more needs to be done in Ottawa to make life more affordable for Canadians.
Families are telling me that they're having to make decisions as to whether or not they can afford good produce for their families. Others are telling me they're having to make the decision between being able to travel to see a loved one versus doing a Zoom session. Like, Canadians should not have to make these types of choices. And in normal circumstances, they wouldn't have to. The only reason they're put into this situation is because the government is spending nonstop, and they're not wanting to exercise fiscal restraint. It's wrong.
MP Thomas also says the Trudeau Liberals are looking into the potential of criminalizing speech. She'll have details coming up in the second half of our program. Provincial health officials discuss concerns that Albertans have raised in regards to a worldwide increase in hepatitis or liver inflammation in children. Our province's Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Dina Hinshaw, explains.
What we know right now is that roughly 170 cases of sudden liver inflammation in children aged 16 and under have been reported globally, mostly in European countries and the United States. While this is a small number, unfortunately, about 17 of these cases have gone on to need a liver transplant, and sadly, one has died. There are many causes for hepatitis, but in these cases, the most common causes have been ruled out, and it is not clear what led to the condition. There have been no confirmed cases in Alberta to date, and we are working to provide information to frontline physicians on this topic. There is a great deal of work being done on this globally, and some cases have had an adenovirus, which is a common cold virus, identified. It is not clear if this virus is causing the hepatitis, but it is one possible cause that is being explored.
Hinshaw adds that this is a very rare condition and emphasized that so far only around 170 cases have been identified around the world. United Way groups across the province are set to reap some serious financial rewards from the Alberta government. The Social Impact Lab will make its way to Lethbridge and will provide new ways to address complex social needs. As Micah Quinn explains now, the Alberta government provided some much-needed tax dollars on Thursday afternoon toward the initiative.
Our government is providing $1.75 million over 3 years to the United Way Calgary and Area's Social Impact Lab as part of our Creative Partnerships Alberta initiative.
The Minister of Culture and Status of Women, Ron Orr, says the nonprofit sector is a major economic driver in Alberta.
The nonprofit sector employs 270-some thousand Albertans, contributes 5.1 billion in GDP. And so from lifting people out of poverty to providing opportunity to connect with others, nonprofits are improving the lives of Albertans at every level.
The executive director of the United Way of Lethbridge in southwestern Alberta, Janelle Marietta, says the organization will also be installing a social impact lab here in our city.
It's not necessarily a physical space. We'll do a lot of the work online. It really comes down to what social issues we're working on at that time and who needs to be at the table.
The labs will teach innovation and design thinking practices using Western and Indigenous methodology.
The Indigenous lens is so important and so vital to creating solutions in our community and recognizing the importance of the wisdom coming from elders in the Indigenous community as well. So that's a huge component of this work and the projects that we're working on, to have that lens, to have that expertise and that insight from elders to guide the discussions and to guide how we solve some of these issues together.
The United Way of Calgary will also provide funding to scale out to smaller communities by working with the United Way of Lethbridge and southwestern Alberta and the United Way of Edmonton. The actual dollar amount is currently a work in progress. For Bridge City News, I'm Micah Quinn.
Residents can soon expect to be charged a parking fee when they attend a Hurricanes game or a concert at the NMAC Centre. Lethbridge City Council voted earlier this week in favor of implementing parking meters at the arena, and an official with the Lethbridge Hurricanes say they were not included on the decision when the vote came down.
To be broadsided, in our opinion, with the vote coming down with the decision that they made without having us there, without us being able to have any discussion or answer any questions that may arise or to give our point of view on how we felt about it as the major tenant within this building. It'll affect us immensely. They talk about how they have done a report. Well, I would love to see that report because I've also done my work and it contradicts what they're saying is the truth.
Hausman says they're wanting to collect feedback from residents on what they think about the city's decision, as he believes this will also have an impact on businesses and homes in the surrounding area of the NMAC Centre. Lovers of books are set for a real treat on Saturday. Canadian Independent Bookstore Day offers an opportunity to browse the catalogs of over 120 bookstores in Canada who are offering deals and prizes to give back to the local community. Penny Warris, the owner of Analog Books here in Lethbridge, says there's a new wall in the store featuring an abundance of local authors from across southern Alberta.
One of the best parts about owning the bookstore, we've just been overwhelmed with local authors and the support that we've got from them and the amazing amount of books that have been written locally. We've just been absolutely amazed. We've got over 50 authors. We have about 80 different titles. And so for Independent Bookstore Day, we thought we would feature them. So we've got a big wall of them and most of them are faced out. And just in the past few days, it's actually already been very popular. So we look forward to that.
Warris says you can also enter for a shot at winning a $1,000 book shopping spree during Bookstore Day. The founder of the Lethbridge Steel women's tackle football team is sharing her story of how the first women's team in southern Alberta was created. Rebecca Medell, who used to play tackle football herself, says the idea to start the team came to be after learning about two other teams in Alberta, but adds it was really God who inspired her to start a team here in our city.
I started with prayer number one, because, God gives us the desires of our heart. So this was something I had desired for a few years. And I just started putting signs around on bulletin boards. Are any women interested in joining a women's tackle football team? No experience necessary. And the response was overwhelming. Like, this is something that women, I think, had been craving for years. I think the answer came as more of a push. Just get started. I think that's often how God works through us. A seed is planted and we just have to take that first step and see what happens. And doors started opening, things fell into place.
Medell says it's been amazing to have seen all the support from the community over the last decade since the start of the Steel's first season way back in 2010. Well, it was a tough night for a couple of sports teams on Thursday night. In the WHL playoffs, the Lethbridge Hurricanes lost 6-4 to the Edmonton Oil Kings and were swept in 4 straight games. In the NBA playoffs, the Toronto Raptors lost Game 6 to the Philadelphia 76ers 132-97 and were also officially eliminated. Raptors head coach Nick Nurse says he was proud of his team, which fought hard this season.
You know, as a whole, I thought we went through a tremendous amount this year with a number of things, and we just kept fighting and kept playing and kept getting better and kept figuring things out, and it was never really smooth, right? There was always a big old bump in the road. Just a lot of that stuff, and I just said, listen, you know, we got to have to get this one out of our system. It may take a few days or a couple weeks, and then but we've got to get ready to get back to work, right? And this is where we expect to be this time of year, is in these games, and we've all individually got to get better so that we can collectively get better and get in the hunt.
Well, there's always next season. Good job for the Raptors this year. Well, it was another warm day in Lethbridge, and if you think the mid-teens is something weather-wise, you ain't seen nothing yet. Full weather details are coming up. It was another beautiful day in many parts of southwestern Alberta today. Jeanette Rocher is in now with a full look at the weather forecast. Jeanette, we think the weather is nice now. Wait till later next week when we may get close to, 30 degrees?
Yeah, no kidding, Hal. We're talking 25 degrees on Wednesday and up to 29 on a Thursday. That's more like it. I know I'm pretty excited about it. Maybe not so much for the farmers who are definitely lacking the moisture. And of course, with those warmer temperatures brings drier conditions. So we do have to think about our farmer friends for sure. Into Saturday, like I said before, beautiful weekend coming up before us here, 14 degrees, 17 the high on sunny Sunday, because it is going to be sunny. On Monday, mix of sun and cloud, 20 degrees the high there, 16 the high on Tuesday, and then of course Wednesday, that 25 and 29 predicted for next Thursday. Now the average high for this time of year is actually 16 degrees, so we're going to be well above that into next week. Average low 2 degrees, 30 degrees was our high temperature on this day back in 1939, and in 2005 we had our chilliest, which was -12 right there. 6:12 is when the sun rose this morning, and 8:45 is our sunset this Friday evening. So well over a 14-hour day there. On the west coast tomorrow, looking at a bit of showers in Victoria with a bit of windy conditions as well, 20 to 40 k winds, 60 kilometers in the Haro Strait there, 12 degrees the high, 13 the high in Vancouver with showers, sunshine in the rest of Alberta tomorrow. Edmonton, 10 degrees the high, and 15 degrees the high for tomorrow in Calgary. As we look to the rest of the prairie, 17 in Saskatoon with a mix of sun and cloud, partly cloudy skies in Regina as well here, 15 degrees, 6 degrees the high in Winnipeg. Now Winnipeg under a rainfall warning, expecting some heavy rains tomorrow, about 10 to 15 millimeters of rain there. Toronto, sunshine and 14 degrees, 15 the high in Ottawa, 14 the high in Montreal, sunshine. So beautiful sunny conditions in central part of the country there. Get your sunglasses. It's going to be a lovely weekend there. Now, not so much on the East Coast. We're looking at showers and flurries still in Fredericton, 5 degrees the high. Halifax looking at rain with 5 degrees the high there as well, 2 the high in Charlottetown. Also a mix of snow and rain there, and St. John's, some drizzle there as well, 6 degrees the high. So there you have it. That is your forecast.
The Canadian economy saw its 9th straight monthly gain in February as pandemic-related restrictions eased. Stats Canada says real gross domestic product was up 1.1% over January for its largest monthly gain since March of last year. That's fueling expectations from economists that the Bank of Canada will opt for another 0.5 percentage point increase at its next setting in June in order to slow soaring inflation. Canada's economy grew at an annualized rate of 5.5% in the first quarter. The federal government's monthly fiscal monitor report shows the deficit for April to February was just under $70 billion. That is down from $282.6 billion in the same period a year earlier. The improvement came as revenue grew and expenses fell. The Finance Department says program expenses dropped 23% to $395.5 billion. That was mainly due to lower transfers to individuals, businesses, and other levels of government. Revenue for the 11-month period was up from $264.9 to $357.4 billion, primarily due to higher tax and other revenues. Amazon is reporting its first quarterly loss since 2015. The company was stalled by a slowdown in pandemic-induced shopping and a write-down of its investment in an all-electric vehicle startup. The e-commerce giant stock fell 9% in after-hours trading. Amazon reported a loss of $3.8 billion for the first 3 months of the year. Last year, it reported an $8.1 billion profit for the quarter. Now, here's a look at today's markets. The TSX was down 359 points on the day to 20,762. The Dow was down 939 points to 32,977. The S&P 500 was down 155 points on the day to 4131, and the Nasdaq was down 536 to 12,334. West Texas Intermediate Oil was down 67 cents to 104.69 US per barrel. Natural gas was up 36 cents to 7.24 US. Gold was up 2.48 to 18.96.93 US an ounce, and silver was down 38 cents to 22.78 US an ounce. Feed wheat is at $14.28 per bushel, barley's at $10.05, canola's at $27.15, and corn is at $12.45 per bushel. Live cattle were up $3.40 to $141.90, feeder cattle were down $1.60 to $156.35, and lean hogs June contract is down $4.60 to $106.38. The Canadian dollar was down slightly over the past 24 hours to 77.75 US. Recapping one of our top stories, Health Canada says it is reviewing the first request to approve a COVID-19 vaccine for very young children. The Moderna application is for kids between the ages of 6 months to 5 years of age. The company says a trial of 6,700 children determined the vaccine is safe and produced a similar antibody response to the one seen in adults. Lethbridge MP Rachel Thomas says Canadians should be concerned that the federal government is considering what she calls criminalizing speech. MP Thomas will have details for us next. But first, here's a look at some of the events happening in and around your community.
Here's today's Bridge City News community calendar. The Lethbridge Senior Citizens Organization is looking for volunteers to take part in their Drive Happiness program. This program is to help seniors in our community who are facing extreme loneliness due to lack of accessible transportation. Volunteers will drive clients to their medical appointments, pick up groceries, and take them to important life activities. If you're interested in this opportunity and for more information, call 403-332-4320 or email volunteer@volunteerlethbridge.com. Lethbridge Legal Guidance is a nonprofit society offering free legal advice to low-income Southern Albertans. It holds clinics on Tuesdays from 4 to 6 p.m. by appointment only. Some of the areas the society assists in include family, criminal, traffic, immigration, EI, and other issues. For more information, call 403-380-6338 or visit their website, lethbridgelegalguidance.ca. And that's your Bridge City News community calendar.
The Trudeau Liberals would like to introduce legislation to combat what they say is online harm. Many Canadians are applauding this move, while others say this is just censoring free speech. Joining us now to discuss this in more detail is Lethbridge Conservative MP Rachel Thomas. Rachel, does the federal government want to criminalize speech?
Well, Hal, sadly, yes. Yes, they do. It's actually that simple. And it's not just one piece of legislation, but I would argue that it's actually a very concerted effort through 3 pieces of legislation. So we already see 2 of those on the table, Bill C-11 and Bill C-18. And we know that there's a third one that's in the works, which is the one that you've already mentioned, having to do with what they're calling online harms. The problem with this piece of legislation, online harms, is that they're framing it as if it's going to protect the vulnerable. However, that's not quite the case, Hal. Instead, what they're going to be looking to do is they're going to look to expand their role in determining what Canadians can and cannot say online. And look, Hal, I think it's worthwhile to just back up here for one moment and highlight the fact that if we're going to talk about hate, we already have that covered off. That's already in section 3.19 of the criminal code. And so, if it comes to hate speech online, people are protected against that already. What this legislation that the Liberals are proposing is going to do is actually make them the arbiters of truth, or the arbiters of what you can and cannot say, what might be harmful versus what might be acceptable. And I do believe that it's a very dangerous path.
Now, Rachel, we've been told by our country's heritage minister that Canadians actually want more regulation in this regard, but you say 422 submissions say otherwise?
So, Hal, there were 422 submissions from individuals, stakeholders, academics, industry individuals. These 422 submissions were held in secret by the Liberal government. They were not released in any public fashion. Dr. Michael Geist, he actually did an access to information request, and he was able to get his hands on those documents. He has made a number of them public on his website. And so I've had the opportunity to go through those, not all 422, but a fair number of them. And of those that I've had the chance to see, they are incredibly condemning of where this government is planning to go with this legislation. If you don't mind, I'll just read into the record. There's one quote here from the National Council of Canadian Muslims, and they warned that the legislation could be, quote, one of the most significant assaults on marginalized and racialized communities in years, end quote. Twitter compared, the legislation in the works to something that might come out of North Korea or China. This is not the way we want to go. This is not the country we want to become. We value free speech. We value the opportunity to engage in the public square. Online platforms are now that space. It is the modern public square. And so for the government to step in and now make themselves the arbiters of what can and cannot take place within that sphere, and be incredibly dictatorial in nature, as it seems they're planning to be with this legislation, Canadians are rightly concerned.
Let's discuss inflation now for just a moment, and our country's debt, which is now over $1.2 trillion. Economists say this is simply not sustainable, and the Bank of Canada has agreed as interest rates are going up once again. Now, Rachel, that'll make life even tougher for families to pay their credit cards and lines of credit.
Yeah, Hal, and it doesn't stop there. I mean, it's their mortgages, it's business loans. I mean, imagine the number of small local businesses that have had to take loans over the last couple of years in order to make ends meet. They're just scraping by. They're not out of the woods yet, and now they're going to have to pay even more in terms of their interest rate on those loans. Look, this is not good. This is not good for anyone in this country, with the exception of maybe Justin Trudeau himself and a few other rich individuals at the very top. But for the majority of Canadians, this is bad. This is bad because of a few things. One, you have the highest inflation rate in 30 years. You have the highest, you have increased interest rates. They're going up. And then on top of that, the government just put out their budget about a month ago, and within it, they have more taxes. On April 1st, the carbon tax went up by 25%. That impacts every single last Canadian, and so it's this triple whammy that is just going to have absolutely devastating effects on Canadians. And so again, I'm hearing from them. They're coming into my office. They're writing to me by email. They're making phone calls. Seniors are coming in. I've had a number of them who have told me they've, in February and March, they turned their heat down to 17 or 18 degrees and just got by bundling up in order to save a few dollars so that they can pay their bill. Families are telling me that they're having to make decisions as to whether or not they can afford good produce for their families. Others are telling me they're having to make the decision between being able to travel to see a loved one versus doing a Zoom session. Like, these Canadians should not have to make these types of choices. And in normal circumstances, they wouldn't have to. The only reason they're put into this situation is because the government is spending nonstop, and they're not wanting to exercise fiscal restraint. It's wrong.
Let's circle back to food for just a moment. I know when I go out grocery shopping, I look at what $100 buys now versus what it bought maybe even just a couple of years ago. Stats Canada, Rachel, says the cost of food has gone up 7.7% in the past year. It really is getting tougher and tougher to feed our families. So let me ask you, what's the answer when it comes to reining in inflation?
Yeah, Hal. So you point to the stats can number of 7.7%, and by all means that's an important number. But I think if we were to put that in dollar figure, what we know is that the average Canadian family can look to spend about $1,000 a year more on their groceries. That's a lot. That's a lot of money, especially when you're already just scraping by. And then, you add on top of that your cost of fuel and your cost of heating your home and your cost of sports, et cetera, et cetera. And families just they're feeling pinched. They're feeling the crunch of this. And so you asked, what is the answer? Well, the answer is the government needs to stop printing money. Stop. It really is that simple. Actually, stop pumping the economy full of cash, because now we have all of these extra dollars going after a limited number of goods, which just raises the cost for everything. And so, number one, stop printing money. Number two, spend within your means. Exercise fiscal restraint. Be responsible. That's what we want from our government. That's what Canadians are telling me, at least.
Well, let's talk about house prices now as well. A new report says buying a home, well, basically it's double the price of a house since the Trudeau Liberals took office back in 2015. The average house price in Canada is now close to $800,000. But I'm wondering what that be if you factor out Vancouver and Toronto. It might be around $500,000. But still, Rachel, how can a young couple hope to own a home in Canada when you'd have to come up with maybe $30,000 or $40,000 down payment?
Yeah, and this one's tricky, Hal, because we're not only dealing with inflationary measures, but we're also dealing with, supply and demand. So there's a significant demand for purchasing homes, but we have a lack of supply. And so at the end of the day, we really need to get more homes built. To do that, a big part of that is scrapping unnecessary red tape, allowing builders to do what they need to do. Get the job done, get those homes built, get people into them. I think we're in a really sad place in this country right now, because there are many, many, many people who hold on to the dream of home ownership who unfortunately will not be able to realize it, because we've just entered into a space where for many it's unattainable. Again, I don't believe it needed to be this way. I think the government could have put mitigating action in place that would have prevented this. What's unfortunate is that, yes, we're seeing this across Canada, but if I just hone in specifically here at home, I think in Lethbridge, we've always enjoyed the fact that our housing is decently affordable compared to places like Toronto or Vancouver or Montreal. But when I talk to realtors here, they're telling me that we're seeing the prices go up here as well, because we have an increased demand, but a decreased supply. And so, we do have this problem on our doorstep. And unfortunately, that has a direct impact on those in Lethbridge who are looking to buy a home.
The world was glued to their TVs watching what transpired unfolded in Ottawa with the Freedom Convoy, as a lot of truckers, who you supported as well, were fighting for our freedoms. Now, there were recent reports that the federal government refused to disclose the justification for invoking the Emergencies Act, which dealt with a lot of the blockades and the Freedom Convoy. So, Rachel, let me ask you something. Whatever happened to transparency or accountability?
I don't know how. I don't know. Justin Trudeau, as the Prime Minister of this country, has touted from the beginning, from 2015, the moment he took office, that he was going to be open and transparent. But I can give one example after another of where that just has simply not been the case. Here we are. We are, reviewing the Emergencies Act. There's a special committee that's been set up to do this, as the legislation requires. And they're looking at it because it was unprecedented. It was a massive power grab, and it does have to be justified. And so it is this committee's responsibility to look into it and to make sure that it was in fact required. Here's what needs to be measured. Were there any other laws in place that could have dealt with the situation at hand? If there were, then it's unjustified. However, if the power wasn't there or the legislation wasn't there in order to properly deal with this problem, then sure, the Prime Minister would be justified in his actions. This committee's responsibility is to do the investigative work, which means that the minister and the government need to cooperate, which means they have to make available the documents that they reviewed in order to come to that decision. They have been refusing at every turn. They refuse to provide this committee with any of the information that is required to make a determination as to whether or not this power grab was justified. And so it's incredibly frustrating for the members of this committee, but most importantly, it's frustrating for Canadians because they deserve answers. They deserve answers. They deserve for the government to be held accountable. They deserve to know that democracy is being upheld. They deserve to know that the Prime Minister is acting in their best interest. And when the minister thwarts the process, democracy is brought under attack.
Rachel, our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau talks a lot about reducing our carbon footprint in our country, yet Trudeau has flown over 50,000 kilometers over the past 7 weeks. This is all the while the Liberals plan on capping emissions in the oil and gas sector by 40%. Something really doesn't add up here.
Yeah, hell, the hypocrisy is rich, isn't it? Look, the Prime Minister, he can jet set all over the place, no problem. Meanwhile, he will punitively punish those individuals who are just simply living their lives, right? You want to heat your home? Shame on you. You want to drive to work? Shame on you. But meanwhile, the Prime Minister can get into his private jet and just, fly all over the place. What's interesting here is that if we just take a step back and consider the fact that the Prime Minister is not paying his own carbon tax on that fuel. No, Canadians are. Canadians are paying for the Prime Minister's carbon tax, for the carbon tax that is applied to the jet fuel that he is using to go fly himself all over the world multiple times over. Isn't that interesting? So they're not only paying their own carbon tax, but they're paying his as well. Meanwhile, he's touting this narrative that we are being too hard on the environment, that there is emissions are too high. And so in order to change our lifestyle, notice, we need to change ours. He doesn't need to change his. So in order to change our lifestyle, he's going to implement a carbon tax in order to help us behave differently. How hypocritical could you be?
Premier Jason Kenney has been meeting with American officials to discuss the potential of resurrecting the Keystone XL pipeline and trying to get more of our oil and gas to the United States. But Rachel, let me ask you, what are you hearing federally in Ottawa? Any chance of that actually happening?
Again, Hal, a really great question. I'm not hearing a lot about this in Ottawa. Unfortunately, I really wish I was. Certainly, my Conservative colleagues and I are very much in favor of seeing greater development within the energy sector here in Canada. And of course, Alberta would benefit significantly from that. We have an opportunity at our fingertips, and we have for a long, long time. And that is, energy sovereignty, energy development, making sure that we take our product and get it to market. Part of that is creating, an east-west corridor. Right now, there's a war going on between Russia and Ukraine, and part of what is funding the Russia war machine is the fact that they are selling oil and gas to Eastern Europe, because Eastern Europe has nowhere else to turn. Well, guess what, Hal? Canada could have been the solution. We could have been the solution. And we should be looking to that for our future. We produce oil and gas ethically. We produce oil and gas in an environmentally sustainable way. We just have this incredible product that we should be getting to market. And if we were able to do that, we would take the power out of the hands of dictatorships such as Saudi Arabia or Russia or Venezuela, which is where these other countries are turning to because Canada refuses to develop its product. It's shameful. And it all has to do with the current Prime Minister of this country who wants to lock up our industry and instead would rather have blood oil from dictatorships supported. It's shameful. If you were to ask any average Canadian, would you like to buy your oil and gas from a dictatorship, or would you like to buy your oil and gas from your own country? Guaranteed they'd say your own country. Why doesn't Justin Trudeau get that? Well, probably because he's not an average Canadian.
Okay, we only have about 30 seconds left here, Rachel, but I want to talk to you about the CPC leadership race going on right now. Pierre Poilievre is drawing crowds of thousands of people. Jean Charest, not quite as many people, but I guess with him it's more about the quality, not the quantity, selling memberships. Have you thrown your support behind any candidate yet?
Hal, I'm staying neutral at this point in time.
Okay, let me ask you something then. Why do you think what Pierre Poilievre is preaching right now is resonating with so many Canadians?
I think a lot of Pierre's messaging has to do with freedom. And I think after 2 years of perpetual lockdowns and people, watching their rights and freedoms be infringed upon, I think they crave a message of freedom.
I think it'd be very interesting if Pierre Poilievre did win the CPC leadership, then there's an election called, and a Pierre ends up beating a Justin. I think that would be something like, wait a minute. That'd be very interesting to see that. Lethbridge Conservative MP Rachel Thomas, thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks so much. Good to be with you, Hal.
There's so much happening in our world right now, such as the war involving Ukraine and Russia. However, you will hear in this next interview, there's been another type of war taking place that may go a little unnoticed. There's something that affects Canadians almost each and every day in a variety of ways. Here in Canada, we've heard a lot about green energy and the tactic of blocking new pipelines. Joining me now to talk about some of these issues between the Canadian petrochemical industries and the green movement is Michelle Sterling of Friends of Science. Michelle, thanks for joining us today from Calgary.
My pleasure.
Now, last time you and I chatted, we talked a bit about the money behind the efforts to keep Canadian oil in the ground and out of world markets. Has much changed in that regard?
No, people don't realize that billions of dollars of foreign funding has poured into Canada through these activist groups to block energy development. And we have a summary of the Deloitte report from the Allen Inquiry on our website. Oil, gas, and coal are global commodities. It's a very competitive market. So if the US, Russia, China, Iraq, Iran, or any competing commercial interest can keep our oil and gas from other parts of the market, then they get a better price and they get a better market share. So likewise, the label dirty oil was the perfect way to demarket the oil sands and push clean, so-called clean energy, making the public think that wind and solar could replace oil and gas and coal when nothing could be further from the truth, because wind and solar are entirely made from vast quantities of oil, natural gas, and coal, and they must have 100% conventional backup on the grid. So they're not energy dense. And I invite people to have a look at Robert Lyman's report, his summary of the Natural Resources Canada report, Inconvenient Facts for Climate Activists, because the real numbers show that we get huge financial revenues from conventional energy and its power and might, and we get almost nothing in return from the highly subsidized wind and solar and so-called clean tech.
There seems to be a real thirst or hunger right now for oil around the world, especially in the United States. And now the Americans, the Biden administration says we're going to be cutting back on a lot of the Russian conflict oil, but instead they're going after Saudi Arabian, Venezuelan, Iranian oil. Why not Canadian oil? We're their neighbors, and it's not conflict oil here. We're able to help out our American neighbors. Why not?
We have a report called Protest versus Green Trade War, and it takes a look at the tar sands campaign using images and messages in their own words. And it shows that there's really a battle going on between the Democrats in California and the Republicans in Texas. And so that's part of the battle. And also what's happening in the world is there's a lack of development of new resources. And Professor Samuel Farfari of Belgium is a chemical engineer and former official with the EU. And he predicted in 2017 that there would be an oil price shock by 2020 because there wasn't enough development of new resources. And people have pulled back their investments. They divested. People like Mark Carney have threatened companies with bankruptcy if they don't toe the line on climate change. And climate activists have driven off insurance companies and bank investors. So it's this lack of resources, along with the bounce back demand after COVID, that's affected global prices, driving them higher. And natural gas, of course, is also a market commodity, and it's always been subject to wild price swings. So we're impacted in Alberta, even though we have lots of natural gas here.
Let's talk a bit about fuel and diesel right now. Vancouver, I've talked to friends out there, it's like $2.09 a litre. A lot of my family in Southern Ontario, it's $1.85. Here in southwestern Alberta, it's $1.58. I think it just went up to $1.73. What's driving a lot of the high price of fuel right now?
Well, again, part of it is the global demand for fuel and the shortage. because there's a shortage of new resources and shortage of product in the stream. You know, if we had been able to complete TMX, Trans Mountain to BC, it serves consumers. Ironically, it serves all the consumers of that Pacific Northwest area. But you know, it hasn't been completed, and so prices are very high there because of the lack of supply. And of course, on top of that, the carbon tax and the carbon tax, you know, for the delivery of fuel. Like millions of gallons of fuel are being delivered every day by a truck, and that truck has to be filled up with fuel that costs more money. So that money is, you know, that expense is passed on to you.
Now, we're seeing that energy is power, and there are costs related to the energy and power we choose. Do you think there's a bit of a deception of how green and cost-effective green energy is today?
Yes, the billions of dollars of foreign funding that's been promoting green energy has skewed the public perception completely. I think people should look at Václav Smil's presentation to engineering students at McGill called Energy Revolution. It's more like a crawl. And he's written about 40 books on energy. And, you know, we see ridiculously, Germany is closing its nuclear power plants, but it's reliant on Russian natural gas and oil. It's completely compromised in the Russian-Ukraine conflict.
Now, last time we chatted, we talked a little bit about Alberta coal. Can you give us an understanding of how powerful petrochemicals are?
We have a report that's called Why Renewable Energy Cannot Replace Fossil Fuels by 2050, written by Robert Lyman. And the cover image is one from an article in the IEEE, which compares the energy density of a cubic mile of oil to alternative sources of energy. And we use in the world 3 cubic miles of energy equivalent, oil equivalent energy in the world every year, and one of them is a cubic mile of oil. So you see that there are dozens and thousands of other forms of energies would be required. And in 1 year, the amount of energy contained in a cubic mile of oil for each of 50 years, we'd need to have produced all those numbers of dams, nuclear power plants, coal plants, windmills, or solar panels. And you can see that on the cover of the report. I was just going to say there's a good article by Michael J. Kelly about the energy return on energy invested in various energy forms. And one of those is that wind and solar do not return enough energy to even support basic society. It wouldn't enable society to continue.
So the return on investment may not be there. Michelle, let's talk a bit about how petrochemicals can actually help lower the cost of living. Can you explain that, how that works?
Yes, in our report, Keep Canada in the Black, we address this. We not only get the energy dense, reliable, affordable power and fuel from petrochemicals, but we also get a vast product stream of useful goods that save time, they save money, food, they save lives in a medical context. And the revenues we get from the sale of exported oil, gas, and coal finance public services and operations, and that reduces the tax burden on you. So our daily lives are also said to have the equivalent of 97 servants just because of the power of fossil fuels.
A lot of times when my wife and I make a decision, we take a piece of paper, we write down pros and cons, left and right, before we make a big decision, whether to move or involving our kids and so forth. Well, a lot of people have been doing the same thing when it comes to coal. We look at the positives and the negatives. Positives, obviously, it gets more people working, it helps the communities, which is wonderful. But the negatives, people are concerned about the Old Man River being polluted with selenium. It's destroying the landscape of the Alberta Rockies. Where do you stand on this here when it comes to coal?
You know, coal is the most affordable, most reliable, and most abundant source of fossil fuels in the world. And Alberta has extremely high environmental standards. So I think that the loss of coal for Alberta was a tremendous blow, not to mention that it cost billions of dollars for coal phase out, like $22 billion at least. Plus, now we're importing more coal-fired power, but from where? From Saskatchewan and Manitoba, or Montana, and of course some BC Hydro as well. So we have to pay out of pocket for that, where before, you know, coal is a resource that Alberta owns. So, you know, now we have less choice about what to power our grid with as natural gas prices spike. Before we could rely more on coal, and now we can't. We just have to pay that extra tab. So that's the sad irony of the NDP coal phase out campaign, that advocates like Dr. Vipon and Pembina Institute said, oh, we'd save $3 billion on healthcare costs. No, we've just paid billions of dollars for nothing.
Do you think that there's a potential that the Alberta coal plants could be reopened?
You know, I really don't know, and I can't speak for any of the companies. I've never been in touch with them. On the companies and investors would likely be very gun shy, because it was the federal government that granted Alberta coal plants the right to operate until about 2060, and only the old plants would be offline by 2030. So, you know, the province overturned a federal legislation, and that makes investors very gun shy, blow to confidence in any long-term project.
You know, obviously with inflation right now, people are trying to find ways to make life more affordable. You know, and sometimes people are thinking about putting solar panels on their homes. At current utility prices, and as they continue to rise, do these systems really pay for themselves?
Again, these are subsidized by other taxpayers, and those are usually the poorer people. So the person who installs the system, they might see some individual benefit, but it's an illusion to think that this saves you money when it ultimately drains the tax pool for everyone and further burdens all taxpayers. You know, you can see our article on the solar farm for the village of Carmangay. The Carmangay solar project's electricity is 7 times more expensive than the gas-fired electricity that it displaces. And regarding the fact that it has subsidies from federal and provincial governments, a portion of the costs, about $250,000, is not covered. So Carmangay has a population of about 261 people. That comes to a subsidy from other taxpayers of $920 per person. And a similar subsidy for all Albertans would cost $4 billion. So we've got 2 or 3 other reports people should look at: electricity from the sun, reality versus fantasy, the true cost of wind and solar for Alberta, and what you need to know about renewables that the Pembina Institute won't tell you. These will fill in the blanks. And it should be noted that Pembina Institute alone has been foreign funded for hundreds of thousands of dollars to push clean energy, so-called clean energy. Don't people have any questions about that? I mean, in 2018, they got $500,000 from the Energy Foundation of the US, and the purpose was to support education and outreach to build a clean energy future. Foreign influence, and lots of funding from the federal government and provincial governments as well.
Michelle, we've seen a lot of these wind farms, especially as you drive out to Waterton, Pincher Creek area, you see the wind turbines everywhere. What kind of a financial arrangement is there between maybe the government and some of these farmers with acres and acres of wind farms? Do the farmers get, like, I don't know, maybe $10,000 a year per wind turbine? I mean, how does the actual business model work? Do you know?
That's a good question, and I don't know the details of those contracts at all. But they usually do draw in the farm community because it's seen as another revenue stream for farmers. And unfortunately, as far as I understand, farmers will also get stuck with the cleanup, because the advantage, one of the indirect subsidies that a lot of wind and solar producers get, is that they don't have the same rigid requirements that oil and gas companies have for decommissioning and restoration.
So if energy costs are actually rising for residents like they are for all of us right now, are they also rising for governments? What are your thoughts?
Yes, because governments also have to pay, you know, they have lots of buildings that they have to power, and they often try to use, they try to greenwash other investors, perhaps the bond buying market, by saying, oh, well, you know, the Alberta government is mostly run by biofuels, or the operations are, we've got solar panels on the roof of the legislature or whatever. But, you know, the problem is this does send up the costs all around for operating. And then, of course, the unions have a cost of living associated with their union contracts. So they want and get more money. And, the taxpayer ends up paying and paying and paying. And we have an article on this called Taxpayer Death by Debt and Taxes, which is all about governments going into the renewables end of things.
So as life gets to be more expensive and there's more of a push for green energy, but at the same time, we're all about oil and gas here in Alberta and agriculture as well, obviously. What do you see as the best path forward for Albertans?
Well, first of all, the public have to be far more energy literate. They have to understand the implications of these. So I hope they'll look at our videos and our blog posts and reports, and they need to demand a full cost benefit accounting, because that's not happening. You know, these things are being sold as a great way to save the planet, which is, you know, of course, everybody's desire. But you know, the actual costs are not being presented, and we have to stop the addition of renewables to the grid in Alberta because it will break our piggy bank. We're financing renewable energy credits for some of the richest companies in the world, and Donna Kennedy Glantz recently had an article on that. So I invite people to look at the costs of net zero. We have one of our professional engineers, a member, sent us their comments to the federal government. It's posted on our blog. So have a look at that, because you really need to understand this freight train of costs that's coming toward us fast.
Michelle Sterling from Friends of Science, thanks for joining us today from Calgary.
My pleasure. Thank you.
On behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless and thanks for watching.